If I was going to characterize the data breach landscape in 2019, I would say that it was fundamentally like the data breach landscape in 2018, only more so. And really what I mean by that is that we saw a lot of the same trends emerging. We saw a lot of the same root causes and breaches, and roughly the same numbers in almost every respect, except when you dig a little bit deeper, what we started to see is the acceleration of some trends that we identified last year that start to point to some interesting things in the future, specifically about how web applications are architected. And that's really what I want to dig into today and point to not solutions for the future, but questions that I think we need to be keeping an eye on. So everything you're going to see today is part of an F5 Labs research series that we call the Application Protection Research Series. And the point of this particular sort of subpart of F5 Labs research is really to marry up very tactical, very focused threat intelligence with more CISO level strategy stuff. And really the way that we're trying to do that is by analyzing trends over longer time series than we usually see. And that's really to sort of get out of this news cycle driven thing where we're all worried about the new threat, the new vulnerability, and the new campaign that just hit. And so last year, as part of the report we released in 2019, there were really sort of 5 overarching conclusions that we arrived at. And the first was that based on analysis of globally distributed honeypot traffic, what we found that all of the untargeted malicious traffic that we saw targeting port 80 was really heavily focused on PHP systems. And I was actually quite surprised to find out that PHP is running on at least 80% of the web applications out there. And this has been true for more than 10 years. And so this sort of really confirmed this understanding that we have that PHP is this big weak point that everybody from every point in the sophistication spectrum is looking to target. The next thing we found was that breach modes tend to map very closely to business models, which means that an organization in one vertical is much more likely to be breached in a certain way, organizations in other verticals in other ways. And to put a finer point on it, for organizations that participated in e-commerce, that take payment cards over the internet, they are significantly more likely to be compromised by injection attacks, a specific kind of injection called formjacking. All other organizations that don't take payment cards over the internet are much more likely to be compromised by what we call an access attack. This is really social engineering, phishing, brute force, credential stuffing, that sort of thing. We also found that the growth in the importance for business and the prevalence of APIs was really changing the risk landscape in ways that people perhaps had not foreseen. And this was part of a broader trend of application architecture, decentralization, disintegration. This is really what I want to talk about today in terms of what we think the future is going to look like. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about why F5 Labs is so focused on application security and why applications are such a focal point for us. We feel it is increasingly anachronistic to talk about the internet as composed of websites. It's sort of like talking about going to a parking lot to buy your groceries. It's technically correct, but it doesn't really tell you much. When we think about all of the functionality on the internet that actually drives traffic, this is like social media, e-commerce, email, media streaming, and almost everything else. It all runs on web applications. And so really, applications have become the focal point at which user needs and business operations really intersect, which also means that they're the gateway to data. And so, in a nutshell, F5 Labs is focused on application security because that's what attackers are focused on. In 2018, we did a survey with the help of the Ponemon Institute of more than 3,000 security professionals, ranging from very sort of network security oriented professionals in the trenches all the way up to CISOs. And what they told us was that more than 1/3 of the applications that they were responsible for were considered mission critical, and that the average organization had more than 750 web apps running at any one time. And the reason why I bring this up right now is that it really illustrates the breadth of the problem. And this is why we think it is so important not to become focused on a specific threat campaign, a specific threat actor, and maintain a very broad view. And that's really informing a lot of the approach that we bring with respect to this application protection research series. So when my colleague Ray Pompon was developing the first application protection report a few years ago, what he wanted to do was get a sense of how different attack techniques map to different components in application. And the more different techniques he added and the more components he added, the model started to look like a mess, and he wanted to clean it up a little bit. And so he came up with this. This is what we call the application tiers. And at first glance, it can look very much like the OSI model or the TCP/IP stack, and I really have to emphasize it. It's quite different. It's much more abstract than that. It doesn't sort of perform in the same way that the OSI model does, but one advantage that it has is it makes it really easy to understand how a specific attack corresponds to a specific application component. You can see here it's a many-to-many relationship. For instance, DDoS is represented in 5 of the 6 different tiers. This really emphasizes that DDoS can be used to target a number of different components. But the more we dug in, the more we found that applications really were, in terms of breaches, were really happening on just 2 tiers. And these tiers are what we call the app services tier, which is roughly analogous to what you could call kind of layer 7. These kinds of attacks are generally what we think of as web hacks or web application attacks. And the other tier that we saw coming up over and over again was the access tier. And this is all this actually mirrors what a lot of the discussion at this conference has been talking about today. It's credential stuffing, social engineering, brute force, that sort of thing. And what we found was, over the last few years, in terms of successful breaches against United States organizations, there's been sort of a reversal. In 2017, web hacks against the application services tier took a slightly greater proportion of the overall breaches. But in the last few years, that's switched dramatically. And now what we're seeing is a very, very heavy emphasis on access attacks. You can see that by last year, 2019, access attacks comprise more than half of all the breaches that we analyzed. So I want to briefly run over kind of what the methodology and sources are like for this study, because there are a lot of people out there doing the same thing that we're doing, talking about data breaches, and all the numbers are going to be a little bit different. So I want to be very transparent and sort of share how we're going about this. There are really 3 important data sources for us in this study. The first was from Baffin Bay, which is formerly known as Lorica. And they operate a globally distributed honeypot network that is collecting traffic that is untargeted. And this gives us a very rich understanding of what we call the background radiation of the internet looks like. This is what either the unsophisticated end of the attacker spectrum or what reconnaissance to prepare for a more sophisticated attack looks like. And this is where we got the data about PHP, and they helped us understand a little bit more about what injection looks like with respect to attacker views. And these guys have been a very, very valuable partner for us. The main source and the next one, which was really the most important source of data for us, were these public breach notifications that we collect from U.S. state attorneys general. And I'll run into kind of what those can tell us and also what they can't in a moment. And finally, when we sort of reached the limitation of those breach disclosures, what we did was we turned and talked to the F5 Security Incident Response Team, the CERT. These guys exist solely for the purpose of diagnosing and mitigating attacks against F5 customers. And so they see a lot of weird stuff. And so we came to them with a couple specific questions, and they were able to supply us with some of the data that they see that answered a couple questions for us as well. So these breach notifications, this is actually how I just spent the last 4 months of the year. We have tried to automate this process and have not been able to replicate the quality. So we actually just go around to all the state attorney general sites and we download them and read them. And it takes a lot of time, but it also provides us with some very useful intelligence. So generally, the letters take the form that you see here. And if you can read that little red highlighted sentence, it says, the unauthorized access involved the insertion of rogue code into the checkout page. This is actually pretty good as far as a root cause in a breach analysis, or breach notification letter goes. They don't usually have that much. But anyway, the point is that we had to read all these manually because this is human structured information, and a lot of times you have to sort of read between the lines to figure out what was really going on. In 2018, we analyzed 761 unique incidents, of which 87% had some kind of explanation. In 2019, we looked at 1,025 unique incidents, of which about 85% had explanations. Now, a few caveats about the breach disclosure data. It's not perfect, and we can't use it to draw extremely definitive conclusions, but they do tell us a little bit. The first is that the N is not great. The data set is not huge, and you might be thinking, well, 1,000 incidents, that's not that bad. But once we start segmenting by sector and start segmenting by actual root cause, sometimes we end up with buckets that really only have 3 incidents, 4 incidents, and that starts to become a little too limited to draw any conclusions there. So there have been a couple times where we've felt like we could sort of see a trend, but it wasn't statistically significant, and we had to rule a couple things out. The next is that, as I mentioned earlier, there's not a ton of detail in these letters. This is sometimes because of people that are writing them. don't have the technical expertise to really explain it. Other times it's because they want to limit their own liability, and so they intentionally leave details out. I'm sure you guys have seen this before. So at least we have to read between the lines. Sometimes we just come away from it and say, we have no idea what happened. Another is that while we were organizing the data into categories, sometimes we had to paint with a broad brush. In one case, we sort of inherited a category from a previous data set that a partner of ours had worked with. The most frustrating category for me is the vertical category that we have of services, which ranged all the way from resource extraction to IT consulting. I don't think you can draw super great conclusions about that sector based on these data, so that's the one I always get annoyed at when I see it. But it also sort of raised some really interesting questions about the relationship between business models and application architecture, which we'll get into a little later. Finally, we also had to boil all these down to a single cause as much as we could. And for the most part, I think that many data breaches, many network intrusions have a number of steps. And so boiling it down to say this was just due to phishing or this was just due to credential stuffing is not really telling the whole story. I realized a few years ago, as I think it was the 2018 Verizon DVIR, they actually did analysis of attack chains, and they found that attack chains are not as complicated as we in the security world like to think. I think we like to think that they had to have 20 things all happen within milliseconds of each other in order for the data to drop. Verizon actually found that most of the attack chains that they were analyzing were only 3 or 4 steps, which is not that long. However, it's still more rich than what we have here, which is a single root cause at best. So take it with a grain of salt. I don't think that this is the only valuable piece of intelligence about data breaches, but it can tell us something interesting. So with that said, in 2018, of all the breaches that we analyzed, there's 761 or so, we found that nearly half, 47%, were attributable to attacks against what we call the access tier. Again, this is social engineering, phishing, the sort of vague concept of email hacking, credential stuffing, that sort of thing. The next most heavily represented tier were the web hacks, and almost all of these were injection attacks. I think it's 17.3 there. I think injection made up 12%, so that was about 2/3 of the web hacks. Other ones were sort of one-offs with specific vulnerabilities, specific CVEs. The next 2 tiers you see, accidents and physical security, are actually really fascinating questions for security, but they're not actually about application security, so we sort of are ignoring that for the purposes of this research. And then the next one is malware. You see malware at 5%. Most of the malware incidents that we looked at were ransomware incidents. I actually think that this is underrepresenting the threat that malware really presents, but you got to go with what you got. The data tells 5%. So for that reason, we sort of are focusing on access and web hacks. In 2019, this pattern became more exaggerated. You see that access breaches are now almost 52%. So more than half of the breaches that we looked at were access related in 2019. And web has also jumped up to almost 19%, and the proportion of those that were formjacking attacks was even greater. Now, things got a little bit more interesting when we started analyzing more by sector. And so what you see here is differentiating by the breach cause while also slicing by vertical, and you start to see some patterns emerge. And this is where I think is really fascinating. This is where we drew the conclusion that if you're a retail organization and you take payment cards over the internet, you're going to be formjacked. So you can see that nearly 72% of the retail breaches were attributable to formjacking. There are a few other verticals here that also had a significant proportion of web hacks. A little bit anomalous. This is what I was alluding to before about the reductive categories, because, for instance, you see in the government there, the public sector, most of the formjacking breaches in the public sector in 2018 were attributable to the click-to-gov campaigns. If you're not familiar, this is a payment card processing software that is marketed directly at small government entities and utilities. And so this was essentially formjacking attacks against entities that take payment cards, like retail organizations, that happen to be in the public sector. So again, this sort of points to the limitations of sectors, how an organization describes itself in terms of how they do business, but in terms of how their applications run, is very retail-esque. By contrast, all of the other sectors we looked at were disproportionately likely to be compromised by an access attack. And in 2019, again, this pattern just became more exaggerated. So by 2019, 82.4% of breaches in the retail sector were formjacking attacks, and every other sector fell off in terms of formjacking. Conversely, every other sector grew in terms of the proportion of breaches that were attributable to access attacks. So I think you guys see kind of what we're getting at here. Here's one final view of the same data set. This really sort of illustrates the degree to which the pattern is emerging, where retail is off on its own and all other sectors are attributable to access attacks. There are a few interesting outliers here. You can see the public sector has a very high rate of accidents. So 50% of the breaches in the public sector were accidents. These were almost all people emailing things to the wrong folks, which is fascinating, but not really our problem. So moving to the question of web attacks, and we've all been hearing about injection for a long time. Injection is like one of the attack techniques you learn about first when you're first getting into security. And it never really went away, but it has taken on a new form. So based on the Baffin Bay, Lorica, honeypot data that we looked at in 2017, in terms of, again, this is untargeted malicious traffic hitting port 80 and getting sucked up, and then they give it us to analyze. What we found was that almost all the traffic was either targeting SQL or PHP. I realize that these percentages add up to more than 100. That's because the SQL and PHP had quite a lot of overlap. Often, these days, you see PHP management front ends with SQL backends. And so that's why you see that adding up to more than 100. However, by 2018, what we saw was that SQL sort of fell off a cliff, and now 81% of the, again, malicious, untargeted traffic is looking for weak PHP systems. And based on the target paths, they were almost always looking for, excuse me, old and unpatched database management software. So injection can be used for a lot of objectives. That's part of the reason why we keep hearing about it and why it's one of the first things we learn about. In this case, almost all the injection that we're seeing in our research is just this type formjacking that I keep talking about. And what formjacking is rather than use it to bypass authentication or modify or extract data from a database, what formjacking does is it uses injection to inject a small bit of script onto a PHP system, JavaScript, other similar systems. And what it does is it puts fake input fields on top of a regular input form. The result, you can imagine, is that a customer comes and enters their payment card information, and then those fake fields, the little script, exfiltrates that to a drop server for an attacker to take. And this sounds like a relatively sort of simple, something very easy to mitigate, and it is not immediately apparent why this is such a problem until you start to understand this in the context of trends in web architecture. So to illustrate what I mean, if you look at a web application like the storefront for Bob's Bikes, what you see here is superficially one monolithic application. And we've got some product info, we have a shopping cart that takes payment cards, we have subscription management and live customer chat there. But the fact is that increasingly, all of these services are not just being developed elsewhere. They're not just being outsourced in development. They're being outsourced in terms of deployment and running. So these are actually running somewhere else on the internet. And this raises really significant problems with respect to visibility, which also goes back to something Brian Krebs was talking about today about the problem in lag in discovery. And the reason why it's such a big problem is that code is actually running somewhere else. It makes it very hard for any sort of security appliance that you might have in line in your web application to actually inspect that. And so if an attacker discovers a vulnerability on the little third-party widget, and they inject the skimming script into the widget, at runtime, the main application is going to run the widget. The widget will run the malicious code, exfiltrate that data, and most of the appliances, most of the WAFs that you're likely to have sitting in front of your main app aren't going to be inspecting that traffic. And so this is the visibility problem in a nutshell. This is why formjacking is exploding in popularity against specifically retail organizations. So here we see the sort of the architecture and attack techniques and business models all sort of coming together to form this really, really big problem. Okay, so switching tacks a little bit, I want to talk about access attacks. As we discussed before, they made up more than half of the data set that we analyzed in 2019. Again, the techniques that we're talking about in terms of the attacks against the access tier are primarily spoofing authentication by use of some kind of either brute force or credential stuffing or phishing attacks. So when we tried to break down these attacks against the access tier a little bit more, this is where we kind of run into the limitations of the breach notification data. And you can see that the single most frequent cause that we're seeing is just email cited as cause. And email hacking is not a technique, right? That is an objective. And so basically, these are the breach notification letters where some savvy lawyer just wrote, email compromise led to a data breach. And it's not very useful from the standpoint of threat intelligence. I believe that probably that 20% needs to be distributed among all of the other buckets that you're looking here. I think that 4% for stolen creds given everything we know about credential stuffing and stolen creds on the internet, I think that's too low. 2.2% for cred stuffing and brute force, I also think that's too low. In 2019, this data problem became even stronger. You can see that now just unspecified email hacking comprised, this is of the entire data set. So nearly a third of all the breaches that we looked at from US organizations in 2019 just said email hacking. And again, I don't buy it. I think that there's got to be something else going on. So we spoke to the CERT, and the CERT was able to give us information from 2018. We're still waiting on their final data from 2019. I was trying to see if I could get it updated for this talk. We didn't get it in time. But what you see here is actually a relatively similar pattern with respect to verticals to what we saw in the successful breaches. And so the public sector, finance, healthcare, organizations that are likely to store valuable information very far from the perimeter, they are much more likely to be brute forced, whereas telcos, retail, and tech, not so much. They were also able to give us a global view of the data, and this is fantastic because until now, almost everything we've been looking at has been about US organizations. And I was actually quite surprised to see what a difference there was between organizations in the US and organizations in Canada and Europe. We don't yet know why this pattern has emerged. We haven't come up with technical reasons or threat actor reasons or anything else. This is something that we want to dig into more in 2020. But I do know that if I was operating an organization in Canada that didn't participate in e-commerce, I would be more interested in a brute force mitigation tool than I might be if I was in Latin America or Asia Pacific. Credential stuffing, I think we've heard a lot today. Brian Krebs spoke very, very well about credential stuffing, so I'm gonna go very quickly here. Essentially, because of all of the really, really large breaches, the breaches with the tens to hundreds of millions of records breached, at a certain point, the likelihood that all of us in this room have at least one username password combo out in some repository goes to 1. And this problem is only exacerbated by the use of password reuse. So again, I don't want to beat this one to death. I think everybody sort of understands what the problem is here. Use a password manager. Moving on. Okay, so conclusions from the data breach landscape. The first, again, to really drive it home, access attacks are the predominant form of attack. Next is that if you are a retail organization or you participate in e-commerce, you are increasingly likely to be attacked by a formjacking attack and have payment cards exfiltrated from your system. Next is that breach modes are driven more by business models and application architectures than by traditional sector. And to really illustrate why I think this is important, I want to talk about a specific campaign that we identified. So there is a software provider that specializes only in selling e-commerce software to university bookstores. And somebody discovered an injection vulnerability in their software and used it to compromise a number of university bookstores. We found 16 in the data set that I found. I think that there are probably a few more. But I'm aware of at least 16 at this point. And when I was going through the data and I was organizing all these things, I originally put all the universities in the educational sector. And then I went back and I thought, but they didn't get hacked because they're an educational, they didn't get hacked because they teach people. They got hacked because they were running a retail organization, because it was the bookstore that got hacked, right? So I went back and I reorganized all of the educational institutions that were compromised by formjacking. I put into retail. All the educational institutions that were compromised by email or phishing, I put into education. And it felt a little weird, right? But it felt like the tail was wagging the dog, because here I was categorizing one variable based on a finding in another variable. That's not how we're supposed to do this, right? But it really sort of provoked introspection about what is it about an organization that leads them to be hacked. It's not really who pays their bills. It's not who their customers are. It's how they've architected their application. And in this case, all these university bookstores chose to outsource payment card processing to a very niche software provider, and that was the reason that they were compromised. So again, we can get really hung up on these labels, like we talk about the natural resources sector, like the mining folks downstairs, or we talk about the educational sector, and that's not really the point here. The point from a risk-based security standpoint is we have to understand what is it about the application we're running that makes us a viable target. So with that said, there's one more sort of, not even a conclusion, sort of a hint, something that we want to explore more in 2020, which was we suspect that there might be an increase in risk by choosing a very, very niche provider. And so the bookstore continues to be the great example for that. Here's an organization that has carved out a very, very specific niche in a sub-vertical. They're not just doing retail. They're not just doing payment card processing. They're doing payment card processing for bookstores. And I would imagine that their sales pitch is probably based around an understanding of the business needs of those bookstores. Problem is, and which I think is great from a business standpoint, that's what you ought to do. The problem is, at this point, it sort of opens up the possibility of someone taking out that entire subvertical, the entire university bookstore subsector with a single attack campaign. And so the term we're sort of using around the lab team at the moment is enfilade attacks. It's a military term, and I am a little reluctant to introduce yet another military term into information security because we have like way too many of those. Too many like war game fantasies, but in this case, it's kind of instructive because attacking someone in enfilade, it's a French term, enfilade, I guess I should say, is essentially getting around to the side of your enemy so that you don't have to change your point of aim to take out multiple enemies. So rather than looking at a line of people and shooting from left to right or right to left, you just look straight down the line and you can shoot them all in one shot. And that's really what we're looking at here. And so one of the things we want to do more research on in 2020 is to find more data about this. We want to find more campaigns where people have found this sort of third-party outsourcing that has led to an entire subsector, an entire niche being taken out with a single campaign. So we've spoken a little bit about the relationship between architecture and security risk and disparate from the breach notifications that we analyze. I also want to talk about APIs because APIs they're not new, obviously, but they have become both more prevalent and much more important for business in the last few years. And we can learn a lot about what the pattern of API incidents in the last 18 months or so looks like. We can learn a lot about what we think the future of attacks are going to look like. So with that said, this is a very sort of abstract and simplified view of what the ELK stack looks like. If you're not familiar, that's Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. It's a very, very powerful tool that has also been implicated in a number of API breaches over the last 18 months. One way you could think about this system is that they have essentially taken components of what probably would have been a single application 20 years ago. They've broken it up into 3 different components. All these components now talk to each other over an API. And the point about APIs versus other ways to integrate an application is that it all has to be web-facing, particularly if you're using REST APIs. So now you've taken your entire web application and sort of flipped it inside out and put the entire thing on the internet. And this can be a bit of a problem, as you will see. So here's a timeline of API breaches over the last several years, and you can see right around mid-2017, the numbers really start to spike, and you start to see more and more incidents, and it starts to look kind of ugly. And there are really 2 things I want to emphasize about this timeline. The first is that the entities that we're looking at here are not beginners, right? It's like we're talking about Facebook, Venmo, Google, they know what they're doing, Instagram, Kubernetes, Twitter, Facebook again, Venmo again. These are folks that have big budgets and they know what they're doing and they're still being compromised via APIs. And if you look at the mode of breach, they basically are one of 3 things. There's either a complete lack of authentication at the API or basic injection vulnerabilities that organizations like this should frankly, that's the basics for them. And in instances where they did have authentication in front of the API, there was no restriction on permissions once an attacker authenticated to that API. So this is again, what we're seeing is a complete lack of basic security by very, very advanced providers because of a visibility problem. And so the API breaches that we're seeing tend to fall into one of 2 patterns. The first is what we call the large platform. By this we mean you could think of the Facebook application, or an even better example would be Netflix's microservices architecture. If you haven't watched the lecture from a few years ago about Netflix's microservices architecture, it is extremely advanced. They've done some amazing stuff, and that's part of how they're able to serve up all those videos. But what it does is, again, you've taken your entire web application, your entire environment, and sort of placed it on the internet inside out. The result is that components in a microservices architecture that are communicating over an API might not look visible to a legitimate user, but to an illegitimate user, to an attacker, it would be the equivalent of cutting 500 doors into your basement and then never going to your basement ever again, and assuming that it was secure. The other pattern that we're seeing are breaches against mobile APIs. Now, almost all mobile applications use APIs to link up a different front end that runs on a mobile device to the same back end running the same logic And which means that the same attack techniques that you would use for a regular application, basically what we're talking about, brute force, credential stuffing, injection, that sort of stuff, all those same attack techniques apply for the mobile API as well with the added visibility problem. And so really want to stress that the issue with APIs is that they have not forced attackers to be more creative. They have just made the job for security folks harder. Now, I don't mean to criticize APIs. I think they're absolutely fantastic for business. But what we've really done with APIs is we've taken the complexity that we used to contain in a code base, and now we've transferred it to architecture, which means that we also have to transfer a more sophisticated understanding of what a security architecture should look like to match this different risk profile. Okay, I don't like to bring problems without bringing some kind of a solution. So here are some tips you can begin to mitigate these new threats. But first, I want to sort of illustrate why we are going to take the particular approach to recommendations that we will. In the same survey that we did in 2018, we found that more than a third of the IT pros that we spoke to had zero confidence in their application inventory. It means they don't know what's running. We also found that a full quarter of the people we spoke to had no vulnerability testing program at all. We also found that 60% of the people cited as the main obstacle to good application security was lack of visibility in the application layer. So you guys see what we're getting at here. We don't know what's running. We don't know what holes are in it, and we don't know what's going on in terms of traffic. This sort of illustrates what the contemporary problem is, we believe, in security. It's not about extremely sophisticated campaigns. It's about the widespread application of the basics. With that said, here are our very, very basic mitigation recommendations. I would say the first thing that any security team really needs to do is go back and ensure that their program is mature across the board. This means that you have to have inventory, you have to have vulnerability management, you have to have change control. This will tell you a lot if change control will tell you quite a lot if people are injecting scripts into your web application. You have to have access control, especially on your APIs, not also on your APIs, especially on your APIs. Because they are obscure and attackers know this, attackers are going to be going against it. You have to train your user base about security in general, particularly about phishing. We'll get to that a little bit later. And you have to monitor your traffic, and you have to keep logs. And this is actually a personal crusade for me. You have to look at the logs. Every organization I've ever worked at, they're like, oh, yeah, we've got tons of logs. And nobody's ever looked at them in the history of their organization. So it doesn't really do a lot of good. It would be fine in the event of forensics, but you can actually learn a lot from looking at your logs. So that's my own personal one. Look at your logs, please. Two very concrete tactical recommendations. One is multi-factor. A lot of folks have already spoken about this today. I have spoken to a lot of really smart folks who have a lot of problems with MFA, and I understand why. The main critiques are about the user experience, and especially if you are customer facing and you can shed users really quickly. I think it is an imperfect tool. I think given all the data we've seen today, it is probably still the best tool we have with regard to mitigating the risk of access to your attacks. So we have to reluctantly conclude that MFA is not going anywhere. Finally, again, I'm hesitant to make technical recommendations because everyone's environment is different, and I always used to get annoyed when I worked in ops and people would tell me what controls I need to put in place. But the fact of the matter is a modern WAF, or to use the sort of emerging acronym, the WAP, which is Web Application and API Protection, these are becoming so advanced at this point that they now cut across a very wide number of control categories. And we realized this when we were making a matrix for our big report, which is coming out soon. And I had sort of control categories on the left and risks on the top, and the WAF was sort of cutting across. I didn't know where to put it, and I finally concluded that these days, a modern WAF, it doesn't need to be a hardware appliance. It can be software-based, it can be in the cloud, but really, these two, MFA and a WAF, in some form should be considered sort of table stakes for mitigating the kind of threats that we're talking about here. Finally, again, I'm going to really harp on this one. You have to put authentication in front of your APIs. You have to be logging what the API traffic is doing, and you have to restrict permissions on the APIs. There are some very, very sophisticated approaches to API permissions that are based on behavioral chains. There is some academic research about this. If you have the resources and time to do that sort of thing, I say absolutely go for it, but at the very least, just don't. I mean, because not limiting permissions on the API is essentially the equivalent of giving somebody root access. Again, train your people about phishing. I regret to say that you will never drive the likelihood of phishing down to zero. Someone is always going to click on that link, and it might even be a security person if we're honest, right? But the thing is, if you can cut the likelihood by almost 2/3, like you see there from a study we did a few years ago, then over time you will also reduce the cost. Even if you don't eliminate every single breach, you will reduce the cost of your organization over time. So it can feel futile to train users about phishing because you know that it's not going to completely work. We still have to do it anyway. So I briefly touched on these folks. I just want to thank them again because they have been pivotal for our research. Baffin Bay Networks, formerly known as Lorica, these guys are fantastic. Their honeypot product is really, really good, and they have been very, very understanding of our needs in terms of data. So thanks to them for that. The Scientia Institute has helped us with data architecture, analysis, data visualization. These guys are really, really good at what they do. We look forward to working with them. We have a couple projects in the pipe right now with them that are going to be fantastic. The Ponymon Institute helped us with that survey 2 years ago. Yeah, so very, very briefly, because I have a minute or two, F5 Labs, we are part of F5 Networks, but we are completely vendor agnostic. All we do is research of the type that you've seen today. If you have feedback, if you agree with us, if you disagree with us, if you want us to talk about something specific, reach out, let us know. Our only job is to collect information, analyze it, and write reports and do these talks. So we'd love to know what you think, and hopefully we'll see you around the next event. Thanks very much.
Are these reports available?
Yes. We were racing the clock to get this analysis out for this talk. So we don't have anything in print yet with the latest data. We will be at RSA with a print version of the executive summary of the same report, the same data I was sharing today. We are also going to have a PDF version of the long 100-page, like the real sort of horse pill of a report. That's not going to be in print for RSA, but it will be available digitally. There are a ton of other research series that F5 Labs does. We have some IoT specialists that have done some really cool stuff on IoT. It's not my specialization, but it is theirs. We also have malware analysts. I don't know that much about malware, so I stay away from it, but a very, very wide range of things. All of it is available online at f5labs.com or f5.com/labs, both work. And I think actually at the moment we're completely out of print resources, but we got new ones coming very soon. So if you will be at RSA in San Francisco in end of February, we'll have a lot of stuff there. Thanks.